Hi, my name is Travis Timerman, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Setън Hol University. Today, I want to talk to you about the symmetry argument against the badness of death. Almost everyone fears death. We might wonder, though, whether this fear is rational. Should we fear death, and if so, why? Is it because death is bad for us? The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus denied that death was bad for us, and consequently believed that fearing death is irrational. Following in his footsteps, a philosopher named Lucretius wrote an epic poem called On the Nature of Things, which contains an Epicurean argument that death is not bad for us. This is an argument that is still quite influential among philosophers today. Here is Lucretius's idea. Most people believe that it is bad for them to die at the time they do, instead preferring to die much later. For instance, most would agree that it is bad for a healthy, happy person to die at, say, 60, instead of 70, 80, or 90. Yet, Lucretius noticed that no one actually believes it was bad for them to not have been born earlier than the time they were actually born. No one believes that it was bad for them to be born in 1986 rather than 1976, 1966, or 1956. At first glance, these asymmetrical beliefs seem irrational. If my earlier than necessary death is bad for me because it prevents me from living an additional good life, then why isn't my later than necessary birth bad for me for the same reason? After all, if the 6-year-old had died at 70 instead of 60, then she would have had an additional 10 years of good life. By the same token, if the 6-year-old were born in 1947 instead of 1957, then she would have also had an additional 10 years of good life. If it is bad for this person to die at 60 instead of 70, then why isn't it also bad for her to have been born in 1957 instead of 1947? Lucretius thought that we would have to treat these two cases symmetrically. We can reconstruct a very simple version of Lucretius' symmetry argument in the following way. Premise 1. It is not bad for one to miss out on an earlier birth. Premise 2. If it is not bad for one to miss out on an earlier birth, then it is not bad for one to miss out on a later death. Conclusion. Therefore, it is not bad for one to miss out on a later death. Like most philosophers who work on death, I am not convinced by the symmetry argument. Since the argument is valid, however, if we are going to reject the conclusion, we must also reject at least one of the premises. One of the most popular responses to the symmetry argument rejects premise 2 on the grounds that it is supposedly impossible, in some important sense, to have been born earlier than you were, but not impossible, in that same important sense, to die later than you will. Now, you might think this if you believe that your existence necessarily depends upon having the physical body that you do with your exact genetic makeup. Your body and exact genetic makeup necessarily issued from your parents, and theirs from each of their parents, and so on back to the origin of parent-given life. So, you could not have been born in, say, 1820, because at that time it was impossible to create anybody with the same genetic material that you have. But let's suppose for a moment that it was somehow possible for your body with the exact same genetic makeup to have been created earlier in time. Perhaps we found out that you were created in a lab through in vitro fertilization, and that the two gametes used to create you were stored in the lab for 30 years before being turned into a zygote. You might still think that it is impossible for you to have been born 30 years earlier. Why? Well, consider the fact that people's personalities, values, interests, and goals are shaped by the environment in which they grow up. If I were born 30 years earlier, I might like doo-wop music rather than punk. I might prefer The Twilight Zone to Black Mirror. I might like board games instead of video games. I would have different friends, families, goals, a different career, and even some different values. If the zygote that became you were brought into existence 30 years earlier, then the person it would become might be so different than the person that you are now that it simply wouldn't be you. Or, even if it would be you, it might not be a version of you that you would prefer to exist, even if this version of you lives a longer, happier life. These are legitimate concerns to have, but they are not enough to show that premise 2 is false. Maybe it is not possible for you to have been born 30 years earlier if everything else in the universe stayed the same. But it is possible for you to have been born earlier if other parts of the universe changed too. If, for instance, the Milky Way formed 30 years earlier, then the Earth would have formed 30 years earlier, and everyone, including you, would have been born 30 years earlier. You would have the same physical body, with the same friends, family, aesthetic taste, interest, values, and so on. So even if you think that these considerations matter to your identity, it is still possible in some sense for you to have been born earlier. At this point, you might be saying to yourself that it's not physically possible for the Milky Way to have formed 30 years earlier. And that may be right. But that won't help the person who wants to reject premise 2 of the symmetry argument, for it may not be physically possible for some, or even all people, to die at a later time. Yet, the physical impossibility of living longer would not prevent death from being bad, just as the physical impossibility of avoiding certain pains does not prevent those pains from being bad. The type of possibility that matters for the purposes of this argument is a possibility that concerns different ways the world might have been with different pasts and different physical laws. My favorite solution is to reject premise 1 of the argument and allow that it is bad for us not to have been born earlier. This is certainly a surprising conclusion, but it is one that I think is not implausible once we recognize that there is good reason for our deaths to be, to put it colloquially, on our mind more than our births. I will briefly mention 2 of these reasons. First, unlike birth, the time that our death will occur is unknown, which creates uncertainty not only about the time that this bad event will happen, but also about how it will affect our lives. This uncertainty is certainly a reasonable source of anxiety for us. This makes the potential badness of death salient in a way that the potential badness of birth is not. Second, the choices that I make affect the time that I will die, but not the time that I will be born. You can take measures to delay your death by being generally risk-averse. You can, for instance, not smoke, maintain a healthy diet, exercise, not punch lions, and so on. The choices that you make on a daily basis affect the chances that you will die sooner rather than later, but they do not affect whether you will be born sooner rather than later. This provides reasons for death to be on our mind and factor into our decisions more than our birth. Other philosophers, such as John Martin Fisher, have also rejected the first premise of the symmetry argument. Fisher argues that while both later than necessary birth and earlier than necessary death can be bad for us, he thinks that we should have different attitudes towards each bad event. We should lament our bad deaths, but be indifferent to our bad births. Humans do tend to be concerned about future harms, caring very little about past harms. If these attitudes are irrational, then Fisher's solution may work as well. To conclude, I think that there is good reason to reject premise 1 of the symmetry argument, although it may at first seem counterintuitive to allow that later than necessary birth is bad for you. It is not implausible once you recognize that we have reason to focus on our earlier than necessary deaths, while never, or almost never, focusing on our later than necessary births.